With me in studio, we have Professor Chuck Freilich, the former Israeli Deputy National Security Advisor and Professor of Political Science at Tel Aviv University, and Ambassador Mark Regev, former Israeli Ambassador to the United Kingdom, Court of St. James, former Senior Advisor to former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and now head of the Abba Eban Institute at Reichman University. And Chuck, let's start with you. Of course, we saw a lot of nice pictures today. How much substance was there, for example, in that signing of that declaration, sort of reinforcing and trying to expand the alliance between Israel and the United States?
Well, I think it was an excellent visit from the bilateral point of view. But visits like this, basically the agreements are worked out in advance. Maybe a couple of things are ironed out at the last second. I think we have, on the one hand, broad agreement and the president's warm, a personal statement of support for Israel, his official support for Israel. But at the same time, there was disagreement in a couple of very important areas. First of all, on Iran, well, the president said that he's committed to making sure that Iran never goes nuclear, but he's not willing to commit really to anything practical on the American side, maybe some more arms for Israel. He raised the Palestinian issue. The Israeli side did not. He raised his commitment to 2 states. And the Ukraine issue came up. It came up, at least in the public statement, mildly. The 2 sides agreed that they support the territorial integrity of Ukraine and the commitment to increase humanitarian support, which may be a way of saying, on the one hand, the U.S. wants Israel to be doing more, but it understands that it can't do much on the military level.
I just note, by coincidence or not, Israel sent the second shipment of, we could call it security equipment. It's just purely defensive equipment, not the weapons that the Ukrainians have been asking for.
And it's minor defensive stuff at that.
Right. Well, Mark, you've been an advisor to Prime Minister. Let's look at Yair Lapid in his first really major, I would say, diplomatic platform. He was in France with President Macron, but certainly nothing compares with hosting a president of the United States. So give us an assessment of how the Prime Minister carried off the day.
I think it's been very good for him. Almost too good to be true. There have been no mistakes, no slip-ups on either side so far. Obviously, there's still a day to go. But so far, it's been very good, and we're hearing a lot of positive messages. I mean, Biden really is a friend. And he espouses that. And maybe the sad news is he's the best friend we have today, maybe in the Democratic Party. But having said that, I'd offer a word of caution to the Israeli audience. Sometimes we have really good friends who love us so much, they know what's best for us. In other words, they think they know better for us than the Israelis do. You see that in the writing of some columnists and so forth. They love Israel, but they want to save us from ourselves. And here there's an issue that has to be raised. Ultimately, it's for the Israeli people and the elected representatives of the Israeli people to determine national security. And in the issues that Chuck raised, Palestinians, Iran, they're very sensitive issues. They're crucial to our national security. And ultimately, these are decisions. We have to listen to our best friends. We have to take their attitudes into account. But ultimately, these are decisions that Israelis have to make by themselves.
All right, gentlemen, we'll come back to that. We're going to be talking about, of course, the next day. Okay, so let me go back now to tomorrow, because that will be maybe the more challenging part of the trip for President Biden and for Israel as well. Of course, Chuck, you mentioned the Palestinian issue. We know President Biden will be going to Bethlehem to see the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, trying to reset that relationship, which went into deep freeze under President Trump. But yes, tensions there and the expectations of the Palestinians, and even inside issues such as the Palestinian dissatisfaction to the U.S. report on the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh. So how do you assess that meeting is going to come off for both the Palestinians and for Israel as well?
Well, I think the expectations for this meeting couldn't have been lower. No one, the president said it himself actually explicitly, that the prospects for progress on the Palestinian front are, shall we say, low. if not more. That is actually very unfortunate. I mean, I certainly agree with Mark that these are issues that we have to decide for ourselves. This is Israel's democratically elected government, which will make the decisions. I think this is a case where the United States is actually trying to help us do what is in our interest, and reaching a peace agreement with the Palestinians, and I still believe that there's no alternative to a two-state solution. I believe that is Israel's #1 national security interest. We are rapidly becoming a one state. It is, to my way of thinking, a catastrophe. It portends the end of the entire Zionist enterprise. I am glad that we have someone who really is a friend, the president, who doesn't believe that he knows better than us, but he is trying to help us reach the conclusion that we should reach. Not much is going to happen tomorrow. It's going to be the minimum. The president, this is a sop to the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. He's doing the least he possibly can. But one point which should be noted by Israelis is that you cannot avoid the Palestinian issue as much as we would like to. Abraham Accords, etc. It is always there.
Right. I just want to remind the viewers you're watching live pictures of the Macabia Games at Teddy Stadium. This is the so-called Jewish Olympics. Young Jews from around the world, Jewish athletes. It's actually the third biggest international sporting event after the Olympics and the Special Olympics. And of course, we have it on screen because we expect President Joe Biden to speak there live at any moment. Mark, I want to go back to the Palestinian issue because there's another item on the agenda tomorrow related to the Palestinians. President Biden will go to the Augusta Victoria Hospital in in East Jerusalem, what some call Arab East Jerusalem. He will go reportedly unaccompanied by any Israeli officials. Some are uncomfortable with this and say slightly it weakens the Israeli claim on the sovereignty over all of Jerusalem, United Jerusalem. How do you react to that? How do you see the symbolism of that visit tomorrow?
It's actually very interesting because the new administration came in after Trump, and they made a decision not to reverse the steps that he took that moved the American embassy to Jerusalem. At the same time, it's clear this is not something they would have done on themselves, and they're trying to find the right balance. Now, Biden has come here as president, and he's showed his commitment to the relationship, to the bilateral relationship. And I'd just like to compare it. In the first year of his presidency, remember then Barack Obama in 2009 came to the Middle East, spoke to the Muslim Arab world from Cairo, and deliberately took a decision not to come to Israel. And he was criticized for it. But he said, this is my policy, and he was quoted as saying, I want daylight between Israel and the United States. That's good for Israel's relations with the Arab world. That's good for the peace process. And now you have a situation where you have a president, and I think we should be thankful for this, who puts the Israeli-US relationship out front, saying this is part of it's good for America, it's good for Israel, it's good for the region, and I think this is a very positive thing, and we should thank it for it. I remember I was in the Prime Minister's office for his last visit when he came as Vice President, and then we had that mishap with the construction in Jerusalem, which cast a shadow on the entire visit.
Right, construction in, again, what's called East Jerusalem, which a land claimed by the Palestinians.
Correct. It was in a Jewish neighborhood, of course.
Yes, in Gilo, I believe, in Ramat Shlomo. Correct.
And I remember that cast a shadow on the visit. This time, Yair Lapid has been lucky. So far, everything's going well. It's good for the Yair Lapid's politics, but let's be frank, it's also good for Biden's politics. He's got elections with November.
Right, the midterm elections.
The midterm elections. The Jewish community is an integral part of the Democratic coalition, so to speak. He wants those Jews to come out and vote. He's not looking good in the numbers, and I think this visit helps him in that way. It also helps him another way politically, because had he gone directly to Saudi Arabia without coming here first, all the press, all the focus would be on you and MBS are meeting, and you've had to change your policies, and you've had to come down off your high horse after calling this man a rogue, after calling this man a pariah. Suddenly, for all sorts of reasons, which I think are justified, in my opinion, it's clear realpolitik. But Biden would have to face, why is this 180-degree turnabout? Right. And now, because of Israel, he's come to the Middle East, he's had a good visit in Israel, he's going there, he can say he's talking about regional cooperation, about expanding normalization. He's not allowed this issue to dominate the agenda, though, if you noticed in the press conference, the American question was precisely on that issue.
Yeah.
Because they say, Biden, how is it that a year ago you called this man A, B, and C, and now you're going to embrace him tomorrow in Saudi Arabia?
Okay, well, let's, for more on that and the trip tomorrow to Saudi Arabia, which many people see as the real challenging part of this trip, let's go to our Dubai correspondent, Bastian Burri. And Bastian, we just were talking about that. What are the risks that President Biden has when he takes that trip to Saudi Arabia tomorrow and confronts Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, for example?
Well, Kalev, the first thing to remember is that Joe Biden is not going to meet with the Saudi Crown Prince in private. This is not an official visit or a state visit, as it is the case in Israel, the one that is going to start tomorrow. And what did we expect anyways, especially since both men, Joe Biden and MBS, have had some pretty virulent exchange of insults lately, let's say like it is. No, Joe Biden and MBS are meeting on the sidelines of a Gulf Cooperation Council summit, a GCC summit, which is a kind of annual high mass gathering all the countries of the Arabian Peninsula. Not only nothing could be decided, no normalization with Israel, nor increase in oil production, but Joe Biden is also taking the risk of going back home without having obtained anything from the Saudis. But he's taking this risk. He's taking the risk of losing out next November during the midterm elections because he believes probably that before the end of his mandate in 2024, the U.S.-Saudi relations can become again what they have always been. That is to say, a special relationship between a superpower on the one hand and on the other, a vital, a key ally in the Middle East.
All right, Bastian Burri in Dubai, thank you for that. And we're still waiting, of course, for President Joe Biden to speak at those Macabia Games, which you see live on your screen in Jerusalem. And we'll bring you that as live. You can see the team from Cuba, young Jews from Cuba coming. There is, of course, a Jewish community, a small one there. Chuck, so we just heard from our correspondent in Dubai saying, of course, there is the risk for President Biden that he'll go back from Saudi Arabia without the commitment to increase oil production that, of course, the U.S. really wants to see. Maybe it has some impact on prices at the pump. But there are also expectations in Israel. We're hoping about overflights permitted for Israeli planes, but also perhaps some kind of broader defense alliance, Middle East defense alliance that Israel can be a part of. Or is Israel setting itself up maybe for a little disappointment?
Well, I think our expectations are very high, but I don't think either the American side or the Israeli side will be disappointed. I don't believe the president would be going to Riyadh or any other capital without basically knowing what he's going to leave with, certainly on the kinds of issues that you spoke about. I believe that the oil dimension of the visit in Saudi Arabia is really the primary reason that he came to the region now, okay? He is not in a good situation in terms of the midterms in November, largely because of the price at the oil pumps. He has to get the Saudis to do something about that. If they don't, that would be a real slap in the face. And I believe that the Saudis have a clear interest, MBS personally and the Saudis nationally, they have a clear interest in bringing about his rehabilitation, so to speak. So I don't think the president will be disappointed on that level. Look, there's this talk lately about a Mideast defense alliance.
Right.
People use that term. They talk about a treaty. I mean, this is too much. We're not talking about a treaty. Some even talk about a NATO. There's no Article 5. Okay. What we're talking is the beginning of, let me call it a regional arrangement, an agreement to work together. Now, this is what we call in Hebrew Yemot HaMashiach, the days of the Messiah. This is remarkable. We've all become a little bit jaded the last couple of years. Who would have ever thought that a number of Arab countries, the UAE, Bahrain, maybe the Saudis, Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, would be willing to cooperate with Israel in an informal cooperative arrangement, at this point mostly air defense against UAVs, things like that, maybe naval affairs. If we get agreement on that, if the Saudis agree to step up their level of cooperation, if they a little bit quietly. If they agree to some of the overt measures that people have been talking about, and that's on the commercial level, on the humanitarian level, of flights, visits of Israeli Muslims to the Hajj, to Mecca, that's remarkable. If the president comes away with that, I think it will have been an extraordinarily successful visit, and I don't think we'll be very disappointed.
And Mark, you served, of course, for an Israeli government and Israeli prime minister that sort of blazed the trail that's being picked up there in Jeddah with former Prime Minister Netanyahu establishing the Abraham Accords. How important is it for Yair Lapid to at least appear that he's continuing it successfully down that path, coming out with something positive for Israel from that Jeddah agreement?
I remember when Yair Lapid made his first visit as foreign minister to the Gulf, he actually thanked Prime Minister Netanyahu for opening the door. Something that's quite rare in Israeli politics, to say something nice about a political opponent. I would say this. There's been a sea change in our relations with the Arab world. And part of it's because the Americans actively tried to help us do it. And I think we saw that under the Abraham Accords, where the American diplomacy was very, very crucial. But also it's a function of the Arab world understanding that maybe America isn't there for them the way they thought it would be. In other words, you had a number of events since the turn of the century where the Arab states have become a little wary. Can they count on their traditional partners in the way they could in the past? If you want to talk about the Syrian Red Line with Obama, if you want to talk about the British decision not to interfere in Syria, there are a series of events that happened that made the Arab world, Arab states, traditional friends of the West, a little less certain about the insurance policy that the United States had given them. And as a result, they sought supplementary insurance. And Israel is in the region. We're not going to become neo-isolationist. Our enemies tend to be their enemies as well, so there's a convergence of interests. And ultimately, Israel is strong. No one wants weak allies. There's no point having a weak ally. So I think the Americans have deliberately and as part of policy tried to bring us together, but also inadvertently, through maybe some of their mistakes or their policy change. When American presidents talked about pivoting to Asia, pivoting away from where? From here.
Right.
And so Arab countries that built their national security on the idea that the United States, like in Kuwait in the first Gulf War, would come and bail them out if there was a problem, needed supplementary insurance, and Israel is here.
Right. Again, I just want to point out, if you're watching the screen and they're at the Macabia Games and you see one of the hosts there this evening wearing a blue dress and looks familiar, that is our Natasha Kirchhoff, of course, I-24 News' anchor, Israel Business Beat anchor, who is one of the hosts there at the Macabia Games. But let's get back to diplomacy, Chuck. And of course, as Mark said, it was American diplomacy, the Trump administration, that helped to foment the Abraham Accords. It was even more than that, because the Trump administration was willing to take steps to induce, let's say, some of these Arab states, like the UAE, selling them arms, the F-35s, with Morocco recognizing Morocco's claim of the Western Sahara, to do really concrete steps and benefits to convince these countries to make relations. Is the Biden administration willing to go that far for some of these countries, like Saudi Arabia, that it's had differences with, like Qatar, another country that his relationship in some ways has been problematic?
I think the answer is no.
Okay.
They're willing to make an effort. I think this is something that the president is sincerely interested in doing, and he will put some effort into it. One of the differences between the Biden and Trump administrations, I was a severe critic of the Trump administration, especially this, let me call it the disruptive approach, overturning policy in just about every area for overturning's sake, just for the purpose of disruption. Well, in a few cases, it actually worked very well, and largely in issues that have to do with us. I think Trump gets great credit after, what was it, about 25 years, give or take, being the president who finally implemented the congressional resolution calling for the transfer of the embassy to Jerusalem, recognizing the Golan, and of course what he did to bring about the breakthrough to the Abraham Accords.
Chuck, I'm going to hold you there because President Biden is going to be speaking. He was being presented there at the Maccabi Games, Teddy Stadium in Jerusalem. Let's see if he says something.
He joins us with the Prime Minister Yair Lapid of Israel, and they're greeted by Mr. Amir Peled,
There's U.S. President Joe Biden.
President Biden, we are so excited to have you with us here tonight.
גבירותיי ורבותיי, כבוד נשיא ארצות הברית, מר ג'ו ביידן, יחד עם נשיא מדינת ישראל, מר יצחק הרצוג, וכמובן ראש ממשלת ישראל, מר יאיר לפיד. הם מקבלים את פניו גם יושב ראש מכבי תנועה עולמית, אמיר פלד, נשיא מכבי תנועה עולמית, ג'ק טרפין, וראש עיריית ירושלים, מר משה ליאון. הקהל מתבקש לעמוד.
Please rise, everybody.
Again, you're watching U.S. President Joe Biden there at the with Prime Minister Yair Lapid, Israeli President Isaac Herzog, at the opening of the Macabia Games, the Jewish Olympics in Jerusalem. You can see a packed crowd there as the athletes come in, and there might be remarks. We're not sure. But certainly, President Herzog is supposed to speak at some point during this opening ceremony, and we will bring you that live. Mark Regev, that's certainly a nice picture for Yair Lapid to have, having been on the job for, what is it now, 2-3 weeks?
That's all. That's correct. It is a good picture, and ultimately, Israeli voters want to see someone who's got defense and foreign affairs experience. And if you look at Yair Lapid's resume, you could say, a critic could say, that it's a bit lacking.
Well, they have said it, Mark.
and this visit, together with the visit last week to Paris to see Macron, but this is obviously much more important, to be embraced this way by the American president can, he hopes, help him. But I'd remind you that there was a similar visit by an American president in 1996 when Bill Clinton came and embraced Shimon Peres, who was then the embattled Labour Prime Minister, and it really didn't help him. Ultimately, Israeli voters will vote for all sorts of reasons. I think this helps Lapid's image, maybe as a statesman, where he hasn't been seen in the past this way. But to say this can be a game changer, I think that's probably overstating it.
I'd even go further because, Chuck, we saw the previous president, Donald Trump, do even significant policy moves to try to help Benjamin Netanyahu. For example, the U.S. recognizing sovereignty over the Golan Heights, and ultimately that did not lead to him being able to win in multiple elections.
Well, I mean, I agree with Mark that this probably isn't a game changer. But remember, the elections are so close. We're talking 1 or 2 seats either way are going to make the entire difference. And a visit like this, when a president of the United States visits any country, certainly in Israel, the impact really is huge. Maybe it could give Lapid that seat or two that he needs.
Right, and of course these elections really depend even on just on a seat or two. That's how close the split is between those basically 4 against former Prime Minister Netanyahu. There's President Joe Biden being waved at. Of course, early in the day, he received a rare...
To the United States of America, say hello to your president.
There they go. We're just going to watch this for a second. The U.S. delegation, young American Jewish athletes coming in, and they are greeting President Joe Biden. That's, of course, the biggest delegation. So as I was saying, earlier in the day, he received the honor at the president's house, the Israeli president's house, the Israeli President Medal of Freedom. Let's go to our Bianca Zanini, who is outside Beit HaNasi, the president's house in Jerusalem.
Bianca, Kalev, certainly a day of meetings.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry. Continue, Bianca.
Do you hear me?
Yes, I do. Go ahead.
Certainly a day of meetings and speeches and pats on the back and talks of future and cooperation. Here at the president's residence earlier today, Biden received the Medal of Honor from Israeli President Isaac Herzog. The two of them also had a one-on-one meeting where they talked about both their personal relationship and their personal connection and roots that they both have to Ireland, and they also spoke of the Iranian threat, and they also spoke of the future that Israel and the U.S. Can have together. President Isaac Herzog said that he wanted to see, he wanted to thank the U.S. and he wanted to see the cooperation bear fruit, and talked about a system, an ecosystem of cyclical peace here in the Middle East, talking as well about the Abraham Accords and about President Biden's next stop tomorrow after he visits East Jerusalem and Bethlehem and continues on his trip to Saudi Arabia.
All right, Bianca Zanini outside the President's house. I'll just clarify when President Biden talked about the Irish roots that he shares with Israel's President Isaac Herzog. He's referring to the fact that President Herzog's grandfather served at one point as the chief rabbi of Ireland, and the family, and his father actually was raised in part in Ireland. His father, also former president of Israel, Chaim Herzog, actually raised part of his childhood there in Ireland. So those are the shared Irish roots that were discussed. Personal chemistry, how much of that, gentlemen, is important in actually, because certainly we have it with President Biden, and we've seen it with the Israeli leaders he has. But as you said again, Chuck, there are policy issues, particularly still on the Iran issue. It's still not clear where the Biden administration is going. Has it given up on the idea of reviving a 2015 nuclear agreement that Israel just thinks is a bad deal?
Well, I think actually the American position is quite clear. But before that, if I could just say one word, I find the pictures that we're seeing here very moving. It took the Jewish people 2,000 years to restore our national sovereignty. And here we have the president of the greatest power on earth and maybe in history, a man who defines himself as a Zionist, says it explicitly, coming and attending the opening of the Macabia Games, the meeting of Jewish athletes from all over the world.
I'm not sure I recall a president being at this kind of Israeli public event. Certainly President Bill Clinton came for the funeral of Shimon Peres, but actually I can't quite recall something like this.
I mean, the timing for his visit couldn't have been better. This is really a dramatic scene. But again, it's the difference between the pageantry of a presidential visit and what you were talking about as a substance. I think the American position is quite clear. The U.S. is still committed to a return to the old deal, to a diplomatic solution, is not willing to really talk and consider a plan B as Israel wants. Israel wants to talk about red lines, about what we're going to do in the various events. Well, maybe on just a purely analytical level, the administration is willing to talk about that. But to say this is what we'll do in scenario X and this is what we'll do in scenario Y, as Israel wants, that hasn't happened. I do think that one thing that will come out of this visit that is important is additional sophisticated weapons that Israel's wanted for a long time, and which will enhance its offensive capabilities should the hour arise.
Right. Again, talking about the inspiration of these pictures, we're seeing young Jews from all over the world there, some 10,000 coming for the Macabia Games. As I said, this is actually considered the third biggest sporting competition in a number of participants in the world after the Olympics and Special Olympics. The Maccabi, I think, founded in 1929, the first games to bring young Jews together, so it even well predates the state of Israel. So inspiring to look at that, inspiring to see the President of the United States there. Mark, you certainly had a close-up look at how prime ministers interact with U.S. presidents, Benjamin Netanyahu, and of course you served under other prime ministers as well. Let's talk about that yourself. How important is that ultimately in the end when it comes to making some of the hard decisions that we're going to be seeing made in the coming weeks?
I don't think you can exclude the personal factor. Obviously, countries run because of national interests, national security interests, economic interests, other interests, but there's also the personal factor, and you can't discount it. I think we saw that maybe at the airport at the landing ceremony yesterday. When President Biden shook hands with former Prime Minister Netanyahu, I don't think that was scripted.
Right.
I even would guess that maybe some of Biden's handlers, some of his advisors would say maybe you were overly warm to the opposition leader, showing him maybe affection you didn't show other people. But the truth is the two men have known each other for some 4 decades. When Netanyahu was the deputy ambassador in Washington, in the 1980s. Biden was a junior senator from Delaware, and they built a relationship, a friendship, and I saw that when I was in the Prime Minister's office, that they could disagree on different issues, but there was a personal chemistry and warmth. And when there are issues that are difficult, sometimes that chemistry can help you. I saw that in the Gaza war in 21, when Netanyahu was still in the Prime Minister's office and Biden was new in the presidency. And I saw in some of those phone conversations very delicate issues, but the friendship, the warmth can help you overcome sometimes and to understand each other better. I'm sure that's true in other cases as well, with other Israeli prime ministers and other Israeli American presidents. You can't discount the personal factor.
Right. Again, the U.S. delegation, there's been quite a bit of amount of space to that U.S. delegation. Obviously, it's usually not the case, but they're doing it for the benefit of U.S. President Joe Biden, who is there in the stands at Teddy Stadium, may or may not give remarks. We do expect Isaac Herzog to give some remarks at some time. They are now saluting I just want to note, you mentioned the handshake yesterday at Ben Gurion Airport, but today, of course, President Biden made the point of having a meeting, a brief meeting, but a meeting nonetheless with former Prime Minister Netanyahu to try to, again, avoid at least the appearance of either interfering or impacting on the Israeli election.
We have a long history of both sides saying that, oh, God forbid, we don't intervene in the other's electoral processes, when in point of fact, both sides have done it repeatedly. But I'd like to make a point to taking off from what Mark was saying. Look, there's no doubt that Biden brings a personal warmth to this, and that it is important. It doesn't dramatically affect American policy, but maybe it pushes it a little further. I am deeply concerned that Biden may, I stress the word may, be the last of the presidents who really bring a deep internal affection or instinct towards Israel. For the most part, I believe we've now had a few generations of Americans who have grown up in the post-67 era, who look at Israel very differently from people of Biden's generation. It's no longer the heroic Israel of the early years of the rebirth, of the fight for survival against all odds, a pioneering Israel. It's an Israel which is viewed, at least by a growing part of the American electorate, as an occupier, and even worse terms are used. The relationship is excellent today, and it may stay that way. There are potential candidates on both sides who could be very good. But in the last elections, we had 3 presidential candidates, important ones, Senators Warren and Sanders, Mr. Buttigieg, who all, for the first time ever, raised the possibility of linking American military aid to a change in Israeli policies towards the Palestinians. Military aid was always the heart, the sacrosanct part of this bilateral relationship. This is now no longer a unusual position. It's becoming almost mainstream in the Democratic Party, certainly on the left wing of the party. And that's where things are heading. And as much as I think that the talk of Israel being an apartheid state is absurd and is a total misuse of the term, that is also becoming part of the discussion. I think Israel has to do a great deal in the next few years if we want to preserve what is the most important foreign relationship we have, and what is one of the fundamental pillars of Israeli national security.
Right. And Mark, you alluded to the fact that President Biden represents perhaps an older and maybe dwindling aspect of the Democratic Party, which is that strong gut support for Israel. And of course, many of the younger, certainly the so-called progressive wings, but even some of the more we think of more of being in the center. You mentioned, for example, Pete Buttigieg, who have maybe certainly don't share that same perspective on Israel in the Democratic Party.
So you're right and Chuck's right, but I think we've got to put it into perspective. All the Gallup polls show that support for Israel is up. Every year we reach a new record. We are having a problem with people on the American progressive left I can tell you I was in Britain as ambassador during the time of Jeremy Corbyn when he was the leader of the UK Labour Party, and then there were all these stories about anti-Semitism to do with his leadership. The British Jewish community, which always stays out of the political process, was outspoken in condemning him for that. And in the middle of that crisis, at the beginning of 2019, he has a phone call with one of these progressive Democrats in the Congress, and she praises him and he praises her back like anti-Semitism wasn't important. And I think here the Democratic Party has to ask itself, what is it all about? Do these more radical extreme voices, do they speak for the Democratic Party, or does President Biden? Now, I know to a certain extent it's generational, but it's also not only generational. And I think it's important that Democrats who love Israel, who support Israel, stand up and speak loudly and condemn those who would consort with someone like Jeremy Corbyn.
Right. I just want to note, as you're speaking, gentlemen, we're looking at the the young USA team there. This generation of American Jews, look, waving the flag, coming here to Israel. Certainly, you say the polls show the general Israeli public, and certainly we're seeing how the American Jewish community is still supportive of Israel, proud to come here, though while being open to criticism and discussion about Israel. But that's certainly an inspiring sight. But let's move now from Jerusalem and Israel. Look again to that meeting tomorrow in Saudi Arabia that begins tomorrow, that summit of what's people calling the 6+3, leader of 9 Arab nations. One of them is going to be in Morocco. So let's go to our correspondent, Rita Benes, who's joining us from the Moroccan capital, Rabat. And Rita, let's look ahead now to that meeting tomorrow of Arab nations, of which, of course, Morocco will be going. What will Morocco be looking for along with those other countries there in Jeddah?
Good evening. Of course, it's a very important meeting for all the region. We know that this visit, our Saudi Arabia, is a very important step in the President Biden visit to the region. Today he is in Israel, and we know that the relationship between Morocco and Israel having a new era, and different partnerships have been done in a lot of subjects, especially the touristic and technological ways. In Saudi Arabia is a major country in that region, and the big alliance are between Morocco, Saudi Arabia, and countries in the GCC. We know already also that very important trade coming from Iran is on the table during this visit from President Biden. And Morocco is an ally with the United States of America. We know also that Morocco is a partner military with the United States, that we know already that the African lion, that some military exercises have been done here in Morocco between the Moroccan and the American army, coming with some Israeli officers, is one of the largest operations here in Africa. So Morocco is allied with the United States of America and partner with Israel, and also partner with Saudi Arabia. So the interests of the countries in Middle East involve Morocco also in the security way.
And there is also the economic component, is there not, which is important for Morocco as well as other Arab nations.
Can I beg your pardon? I haven't heard you, please. Repeat the question.
I'm sorry. I said there is also the economic component, which is, of course, of importance to Morocco as well as all the other Arab nations, especially in the current environment.
Exactly. The economic situation is very important, also including Morocco. We know also that the crisis of the oil and decreasing of the price is hitting Morocco also. We know also that the problem of gas, including by the crisis between Russia and Ukraine, is making a big problem in the world. We know also that President Biden will talk oil with the Saudi Arabia to increase the production for oil, to try to decrease the price of the oil in all the region. We know also that in the economic way, a lot of partnerships are done between Morocco and Israel in the few last months, including, like I said, the tourism, including also the health and the new technology. So Morocco is involved in the economic situation of all the region.
All right, Rita Benes, thank you there in Morocco for that. And joining us, we're still with, of course, Professor Chuck Fleiber, Mark Regev, and joining us is Hiba Al-Qudssi. She's the Washington bureau chief of the Ashraq Al-Awsat newspaper. I hope I pronounced that reasonably close, Hiba.
Very close.
Okay, thank you for joining us. And as you heard, we're just talking with our correspondent in Morocco about that summit in Saudi Arabia tomorrow. Maybe let's talk about that from the perspective of the Arab world, what they are expecting, and we know what Israel is hoping for, which is some maybe boost in recognition or process toward normalization with Saudi Arabia, and maybe even stepping forward to some of those other countries that are going to be there that Israel doesn't have a relationship with. What about the Arab world and the Arab participants in that summit?
Of course, Iran is the most important subject in the summit tomorrow and the day after with the Gulf countries. Iran is a mutual challenge for both Israel and the Arab world. So there is some concern that the nuclear program is going very fast. Iran is very close to get the nuclear capabilities, and not only the nuclear program, but also the ballistic missiles, all the proxy groups that Iran are supporting in the region, especially Hezbollah in Lebanon and in Syria and Iraq and Yemen, of course. One of the most important subjects for President Biden, he wants to extend the truce and make it more credible for the Yemenis. So people are expecting, the Arab countries and Arab leaders are expecting from President Biden to be more, the American presence is more credible in the region, more spoken, to speak up about Iran, and to have some kind of coordination, maybe military coordination, maybe some kind of intel coordination, so the countries in a whole, in a group, can really face Iran and its ambitions in the countries. But I also want to talk about the Israeli ambition in that trip.
Sure.
Because Mr. Prime Minister, he said a very strong message this morning at the press conference. He said that we want peace. We want to have peace with all the region. We want to deepen our integration in the region. So that's a very good message and a very impressive message. And I want to remind him, and I want to remind all the Israelis that Saudi Arabia has submitted a peace initiative 20 years ago. She offered that she recognized the Jewish country in return for the legitimate rights for the Palestinians.
Well, I was just saying a return to the 1967 borders, which is a complicated issue for Israel.
It's a complicated issue. It's argumentative, but at least Saudi Arabia made the first step 20 years ago. So if you are talking about a serious desire to have peace, let's sit down and have a serious talk about peace and about this initiative that was approved by the Arab League.
Just to clear though, is that a sort of an ironclad precondition for Saudis that they want to see that before they'll take any I won't say any steps, but certainly a major step toward normalization?
No, the major step that I'm expecting is about opening the air for the Israeli charters.
Right, the overfly.
Regarding the two Egyptian islands, Tiran and Sanafir, it will be a ceremonic transfer of the control and all the security measurements to Saudi Arabia, and there are some kind of engagement economically, which has been very successful with UAE. And this morning there were very successful initiatives with UAE and India. And
right, that U2I2 initiative, quite a United States, United Arab Emirates, India, and Israel, a new regional grouping that could be added on. Others could be added to it, certainly.
Yes, I believe there are a lot of subject to be discussed.
Right. Chuck, you looked like you were going to jump in there when I asked about the Palestine, when she raised the importance of the Palestinian issue for the Saudis. We should also say, we talked earlier from the gentleman from Morocco, another country, even though it did normalize relations with Israel, certainly for them the Palestinian issue still is a major agenda item.
Well, as I was saying before, first of all, one of the things that you see in this visit is no matter how much some people in Israel may wish to wish the Palestinian issue away, it can't be done. It is there. It is a critical part of the American-Israeli relationship. It's an issue in its own right. It's there, and it has to be addressed. Now, pretty much everyone agrees that there isn't much in the way of a possibility for significant progress at this point. The Saudis seem to still want some sort of progress of some significance before they can come out openly and embrace the relationship, at least while the king is still alive. Things could change when MBS succeeds him and takes the throne. And I'd like to point out that in 2018, I believe it was, he came out with a statement saying explicitly that he recognizes Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state in the Middle East. And that was really, I believe, a Sadat-like moment. That was one of the great moments in the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict. I don't think he got sufficient credit for that. And I think he's trying to do what he can, given the politics in Saudi Arabia, to go forward at this point.
Right. And